I introduced Blake. Blake Hawkins is a graduate student at the UBC High School, completing his thesis on LGBT youth, everyday health information. His research interests include information, studies, and public health researcher interests in the health information behaviors, online health interventions, and health geography of gay and bisexual men. Blake.
Thank you. Okay, so this is just a piece of my thesis. It's sort of post-thesis work that I wanted to start on before finishing my thesis, so I can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I know there isn't. But anyways, the paper is titled, "Where Were the Non-Heterosexual Young Men?" And the challenges and need for further research on participant recruitment methods for qualitative research. So before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging the 11 participants who were a part of my project, who I just came in after talking with the Pride Center organizers at the University of Northern British Columbia about doing this work, and most of them just shrugged their shoulders and said, sure, why not? So it's really great to get that support from them. And as well, I also want to thank my supervisors, Luann Frund and Elizabeth Staywick, for supervising this project, especially for Luann. Her background's in information retrieval design. She had very little of a background in this area, and she was very supportive of the work I wanted to do. So I'm going to begin by providing some of the purpose for this presentation, as well as the background behind the project and a discussion about sexuality and masculinity in northern BC, and especially in Prince George, where the fieldwork occurred. After that, I'll discuss the 3 ways that participants were recruited, and then the responses that I received from people who were trying to be recruited and the outcomes from that process. And then I also want to discuss one of the interesting things that came from actually the field work, which overlapped with participant recruitment, which was the differing perceptions of queer spaces in northern BC. And then finally, just some further comments about where people can go from here in regards to recruitment methods for this type of work. So I would say that there's been a lot of discussions I've had with different people, some in this room and elsewhere, that there's a lot of times people don't realize that there's a lot of different challenges when you're doing field work, especially in non-urban geographies, when it comes to working with non-heterosexual populations, especially men, and when it comes to recruitment. And a lot of times in the literature, there's really not much discussion about those challenges. A lot of time it comes more anecdotally from your supervisor, just rushing you away from certain methods and certain participants, or in many cases, I've heard this comments of, we should be thinking about that, and maybe something else would be better. But there isn't too much actually in the literature that discusses these types of challenges, and I think that's really problematic, especially for early career researchers who have these overly ambitious ideas, and sometimes after the first couple weeks of recruitment, they realize that they should scale back a bit. Again, I'm not trying to vent. So the background on this project, which is now I call it my baby, because it's been such a labor of love I've put into it. So I want to research where LGBTQ youth go for their health information seeking behaviors, and the places that they go in Prince George for their health information. And I want to understand their health information seeking behaviors. I also want to look at the role of place, and then as well the characteristics of places that they preferred, somewhat preferred, and disliked. And this involved the participants completing participatory maps, where they map out in Prince George spaces they somewhat preferred, disliked, and preferred to go for health information. And then we had a free-for-all conversation about what is health information, how do they define it, how do they act in different spaces, and that's what my thesis is about. But it was really interesting just to get that type of discussion with them, because a lot of them, when I said the words health information seeking, they looked at me rather blankly. But by the end of the conversation, they were experts and very opinionated, which was awesome. So the fieldwork for my project occurred in Prince George, BC, which if you're unfamiliar with it, it's in the central part of the province. The map, you can see it up there. Supposedly it has 90,000 people. I think it's around more near 70. They always like to oversize how many people live there. It differs year to year every time I go back there. It's a very interesting community, if any of you have ever been there, because in some ways it's urban in the sense of how people act, but then at the same time, because there's a university, there's some high-tech companies in the region. However, at the same time, there's still a large rural population in a sense, like there's a lot of farming communities around it. So it's very much a paradoxical geographies in the sense that it's two types of spaces concurrently. And so for that work, I moved up to Prince George in August 2015, and I stayed there till January 2016. I interacted with the Northern Pride Center to get their support and a bunch of other queer-based groups up there. And initially, I was going to only have non-heterosexual young men as participants, but I was forewarned by my community partners that that was a bit ambitious and borderline delusional, depending on who was the respondent. There are some very opinionated people at the Pride Center up there, which gave excellent feedback for my work, and I am very grateful for them. So Prince George, there's been some work done by John Olaf with Stephanie Cohen and Joy Johnson. They wrote a paper on masculinity in Prince George, and they describe it very much in a rugged type of masculinity, which I also agree with. And a lot of that is based on the fact that there's a long history of resource extraction, like the forestry industry, and there's more recently mining industry. And they describe in their work and things that I experienced by living there for both that 5 months and as well for 4 years before as a student, is that there is a lot of people who associate with these ideas of masculinity that might be considered more outdated in other areas, but up there, there are still people who do a long day working at the mill, then they go home to their spouse and children. So that's really the environment. And I use the word unhealthy here, but I sort of perceive masculinity in Northern BC at times more as toxic, but that's more my personal opinion of it. And the idea of there's so many smaller communities that basically have no existing queer spaces or even opportunities for queer spaces. And I know that I was discussing before with this paper, as it's now out in Geography Journal of Antipodes. I was speaking with the editor, and she was asking me if there's any spaces that people queer in non-times. For instance, she was asking about graffiti or anything like that that's used as a way to queer spaces, and there's even opportunities like that because there's such a strong form of masculinity, in my opinion, that is found in this part of the province. And there's a lot of issues I find with completing work on sexuality in Northern BC. Most of the work that's been done that's been really great is more quantitative in nature. Like they'll basically do surveys and that's it. And I know that there's also been some more public health-based work that's been done up there. And it's very hard to describe, and I only have so many minutes to do it in. Prince George is has a smaller non-heterosexual male population compared to a larger non-heterosexual woman population. From the women who participated in my work, they described Prince George as this awesome space, and they had no issues with it, and they said that it's really great. I know on more than one occasion, I saw lesbians holding hands downtown Prince George, and they faced no issues, but I've never, in almost 6 years living there, I've ever seen two non-heterosexual men holding hands in the entire city. And even at the gay bar, they'll hold hands inside the bar, then they'll stop right the moment they leave. So it's very interesting just seeing that dynamic there between the non-heterosexual women and the non-heterosexual men. And another interesting piece about sexuality in Prince George is that a lot of the older, late youth to adult queer people or non-heterosexual men in the city are from smaller communities in Northern BC that migrated to Prince George. And a lot of people who are originally from Prince George, they then move on to states like Vancouver, Toronto, Kelowna. So it's a very interesting dynamic there. So for people who are from smaller towns, in many cases, they consider Prince George okay, but not great. But then for people who are from Prince George, who moved to Vancouver, including one of my friends, he's like, I would never go back to that place. So it's a very interesting dynamic there. So that's just a bit of the background on it. So for the recruitment, I started off with the Northern Pride Center, which is a club on campus. They have a space in one of the student union buildings. And it's open 24/7. They have volunteer counselors. They have a variety of services. They do different events downtown to create some more community building networks, and they host other events. And they were my initial partners in starting this project. They provided a lot of the validity that I needed and legitimacy for the project, and having the president of the organization basically blast out any requests I had for messages, and she would get people to come. At my first event, it was only, I thought, like one person showed up, then she just messaged a couple people, then they showed up. So she was very helpful. She was a very strong-willed woman. I am very much indebted to her for my work. Next, I created a Facebook page, which I thought would be more active. Like, no one ever posted anything on it. I sent it out. They were basically indifferent about using this Facebook page, but they had their own Facebook page through the Pride Center, and they're very active on it, but they didn't want to ever post anything on this. They couldn't be bothered. So I ended up just deciding to post everything onto the Pride Center page, which worked out really well, because a lot of participants were just like, hey, I saw your message 15 minutes ago, and here I am. So I was just like, okay. So it worked out in some ways, having a Facebook page, but in other ways, it's sort of differed from the literature, which describes more of this active youth population when it comes to recruitment with social media. And then one of the more interesting things, this is the poster that I used for recruiting participants. And one thing that was really interesting with my work is the fact that they saw the word UBC, and a lot of them were very hesitant. They didn't like the fact that it's from UBC. For some cases, before meeting me, they had assumptions of what would come about of me being from the university in Vancouver. For some participants, they said, are you just one of those people from Davie Street? And I said, no, I live in Marpool. I'm not one of those people from Davie Street. But no, they were very strongly opinionated, because one of the questions that we actually asked for the field work was, would you act any differently in Prince George compared to Vancouver? And a lot of them said I wouldn't go to Vancouver. They just had very strong opinions about it. And I know, like, I was quite surprised, because I did my undergraduate in Prince George, and I had only left around 15 months before that, and even in that much of a time frame, they're like, you're from Vancouver. And I was like, no, I'm literally not from Vancouver. I've lived here for a year. I'm not a Vancouverite. But no, they were very adamant on that fact. So that was one of the, there were a variety of responses from participants during this recruitment process. As I just said, some of them were a bit hesitant because I wasn't from UNBC and that I was from a larger institution from Vancouver. One of the things that was really interesting is we did a panel in October. There was an event that they had at UNBC. They do it each fall. It's called Inspiring Women Amongst Us. And I planned a panel for it on the lived experiences of LGBTQ people in Prince George and northern BC. And it was really well attended by non-heterosexual women and even trans people. But there was only 2 non-heterosexual men who were in the room. And they were people who I asked, would you come? And they showed up. So one of the really interesting things from this event that gave me some forewarning of what would come about with the field work that happened 2 months later is I actually got emailed by someone saying that they were just so uncomfortable with being in that type of space, which I found really interesting in the fact that they just said, I wish I could be there, but I just don't feel comfortable. So that was one of the most strong responses that I actually got from a participant. And then as well from the recruitment, as I already said, is that there were far more women than there were men. And as well, a lot of the 2 men who were recruited, I had to put a lot of effort in, and I had to tell them what was happening, go in much more detail, compared to the 9 women who in many cases either showed up with a friend or they were just already in the Pride Center, because that's just where they stay between classes. And they said, I have an hour, sure, I'll participate. And then I told them they would get a gift card to Subway, and they said, cool. So it's sort of interesting in that dynamic. Like, they just didn't really care about talking about their health. So as I just said, sometimes when completing research, I think that one thing to recognize is that there's different perceptions on queer space, which I think sometimes you might take for granted living in a place like Vancouver or Toronto or any larger urban city. And that for many of these youth, especially for the young men, they had very much internalized barriers with going into these queer spaces, like the Pride Center where we hosted this focus groups. And originally we thought it would be very convenient and again, it's a very large sample because it was at a very visible space for these participants. But in actuality, it was very much the opposite. There was much hesitation. And then as well, there's just so much more that needs to be understood about queer spaces, especially in a northern geography like northern BC and Prince George. So I'm going to end on this. I'm very strongly opinionated about this. I think that there's a real privilege associated with completing queer-related research with either non-heterosexual men or non-heterosexual women. But I think especially with non-heterosexual men, I think that at first, after I completed this work, I blamed myself for saying maybe I did something wrong, but I think that there's such larger and I argue geographical challenges that can be associated with doing this type of work that has a longer legacy than just me showing up even 5 years ago or showing up August 2015 to do this work, and that there's only so much a researcher can do, but it's important to acknowledge that there are a lot of barriers and there are a lot of ways to overcome this. Like the paper that came of this, like we discussed the fact that you can use social media potentially, or potentially be more flexible with where you have your focus groups or having your meetings with individuals. As we had this assumption that Pride Center would be a very safe space, but in actuality, it became more of a hindrance for some participants, even though it was a benefit for other participants. So I will leave you with that.
We have time for a couple quick questions, if there's any questions for Blake.
Sorry, I just have one quick question for Blake.
Almost got away.
Sorry. So when you actually went to the Pride Center, and were there actually gay guys hanging around there?
Yeah, there were.
There were. So it wasn't that they weren't there, it's just that they didn't really feel comfortable participating in the research.
Yeah, well, the thing is that there were some who would go there, and those were the ones who participated, but I assumed that more would show up. But I know that the people who run the Pride Center say they see a lot of non-heterosexual men at the bars, but they sort of like go the other direction when they see them in the hallway at the university or anywhere in town. So there's that real paradox there. But it was just more, we assume potentially that they might show up just based on who we see in the city, but actually they ended up not showing up.